Welcome back to the best podcast around, as long as you don't count any other podcasts that are around. Welcome back to the Politics with Paul podcast with your host, me, Paul Rader. Today, we're going to talk about incumbent reelection rates. So, another election has come and gone, and there is some considerable change coming. But at the same time, there are lots and lots of familiar faces that are still in office and in the same seats they were in before. In some ways, the more things change, the more they stay the same. Lots of incumbents ran in 2024 and lots of them won, and that's typically what you see in elections these days. But why do we see them win so often? We seem to hate politicians so much, and we seem to be perpetually frustrated with them and their performance, but we still reelect them at very high rates. What's behind this apparent disconnect? And just how many incumbents did we see reelected in the 2024 election? Well, that's what we're going to talk about today. So let's dive in. So, first of all, what exactly is an incumbent? That might seem like a straightforward question, but just in case, let's go over it real quick. An incumbent is somebody who is already in office and is running for election again to that same exact office. Now, a little bit of a slight exception here is if a candidate is running again for a districted office, like Congress, where there's a first congressional district, second congressional district, or state legislature, where there's first, second, third state senate districts or state house districts, and redistricting changes the district they are in, they are still considered an incumbent. So if you're the third House district representative in Georgia and redistricting happens and it puts you in the fourth district, you're still technically an incumbent. So a little bit of a difference there, but it's not someone who is in an elected office already and then they run for a different office. One common stepping stone is from U.S. House to U.S. Senate. They're not considered an incumbent because they're not in the U.S. Senate yet, and they're leaving their current seat. So that is an open seat. And those open seats are when incumbents decide to retire or to run for a different office. So incumbent versus open seat. And generally speaking, you can expect incumbent reelection rates to be pretty high in the 80 to 90% range, depending on the type of office and where it happens. Sometimes can fluctuate a little bit, but you tend to see a large advantage that incumbents have when they run for reelection. Again, we reelect people so often, but we're so perpetually frustrated with them. What's behind this apparent disconnect? Well, this is mostly a reference to an observation regarding Congress, but you can somewhat extend it to other political offices. And this is what we call the Fenno Paradox. Simply put, it's the observation that Congress has considerably low levels of approval, but incumbents experience high rates of reelection. You see approval rates of Congress in the teens, however you say it, even in single digit range a lot of times, but we see massive reelection rates for congressional incumbents well into the 90s. And it's been that way for quite a while, at least 50, 60 years, a little bit of fluctuation here and there. But generally speaking, it's very high reelection rates. Everybody hates Congress, but they tend to love their congressperson. And this is called, again, it's called the Fenno Paradox, which is Fenno. It's named after the late, great political scientist Richard F. Fenno Jr. He wrote 19 books on Congress, was a distinguished university professor emeritus at the University of Rochester. Sadly, he passed away at 93 years old in 2020. But he was really the first to directly observe members of Congress in the field instead of taking a broad institutional view. He was much more of a hands-on guy as opposed to just bird's eye view kind of deal. Fenno's paradox, though, goes back to at least a 1975 essay titled, "If, as Ralph Nader says, Congress is the broken branch, how come we love our congressmen so much? And specifically, a quote from there: "We do, it appears, love our congressmen. On the other hand, it seems equally clear that we do not love our Congress." But Fenno's Paradox is more synonymous with his 1978 book, Home Style: House Members and Their Districts. And again, that was where Fenno spent a lot of time with members of Congress, both on Capitol Hill and in their home districts on the campaign trail, noting differences in how they did in both environments. So, members of Congress, while they were in their home districts, they would distance themselves from the overall body of Congress. No. It's those guys. They're the problem, not me. Quite frankly, I think Congress sucks too, and I'm just trying to fix things. It's never my fault. It's always the other guys. And you know what? That's what the rest of Congress tends to say too. It's not fashionable to say that, well, Congress is actually, yeah, they're having a hard it's a hard job, and they're doing their best. No, you tend to distance yourself from Congress because everybody hates Congress. Again, you even see single digit level approvals of Congress where only like 8, 9% of people say Congress is doing a good job. Basic reason we see this disconnect, though, of why we see people hate Congress but love their congressperson, reelect a congressperson, is, well, we only elect the congress people representing our specific slice of America, and we often separate them from the rest of Congress. So if your state has a U.S. Senate election in a given year, not always going to happen, but if your U.S. senator is for your state or your U.S. congressperson for your district, you're only voting on those people. You're not voting on all of the U.S. Senate or all of the U.S. House. That'd be way too many races to keep track of. But we often like our congressperson because they're bringing home projects to our congressional district. But a lot of times we also see these projects that are happening in other districts. Those tend to be considered wasteful. That's not helping our district. Well, if that's yeah. I mean, why are they doing this thing? We're also doing it, but why are they doing this exact thing? Not necessarily the exact same kind of project, but it's a lot easier to think a project happening elsewhere is wasteful when you and people around you are not directly benefiting from it. So, oftentimes see the rest of Congress as wasteful, but our congressperson's bringing home the bacon, so to speak. Now, as for extending this paradox to other non federal officials like governors and state legislatures or even local officials, there's a lot less public opinion data that is available on these officials. But Fenno's paradox might extend to them to varying degrees as well. But in any case, we see high incumbent reelection rates like Congress shows, regardless of political public opinion on these local institutions like governorships and state legislatures and so on. The historical data on incumbents, though, is a little bit more mixed, however, as you'll see later. We'll talk a little bit about it, but just as a little bit of a preview, presidential reelection bids have a more mixed history. They win more when they run for reelection, they win more often than not, but not by a whole lot. Not the kinds of reelection rates you see in Congress, for example. And gubernatorial election rates have mostly gone up since the 1960s, but back then it wasn't happening a ton either. So, why is it that these incumbents have such an advantage? It's a very well documented advantage that incumbents have, regardless of Fenno's paradox. Incumbents have a very strong advantage a lot of the time. But what are some of the reasons for that? Well, some reasons, and this is not by any means a comprehensive list, and specific cases of elections will have unique factors that benefit that specific incumbent. But these are general examples of boons that incumbents have. For example, name recognition. Simply by virtue of already having that office, you have the name recognition. A lot of times, challengers usually have to work harder to get people to learn about them. And when you don't really know somebody, usually you're not going to support them. And you also see these incumbents' names all over the place, even outside of campaign contexts. If they're, for example, Now, I'll use Florida as an example. The Department of Agriculture and Consumer Services, usually just Department of Agriculture for short, but the commissioner there, currently Wilton Simpson, was previously Nikki Fried. Their names are on gas station, or whoever is the incumbent for that, their name is on gas station pumps to certify that they have, or their office has inspected these gas station pumps and that they're good to go. So you happen to see their names all over the place in that regard. And you'll see a similar case for other state executives being things like governor, attorney general, secretary of state. You'll see their names all over the place simply because they're already in the office and they are certifying all sorts of different things going on around the state. You'll see them on paperwork all the time. So you tend to know who they are already. Obviously, challengers don't get that luxury. Some challengers will come in with a lot more name recognition, but generally speaking, the incumbents will have the advantage when it comes to people already knowing who they are. Another advantage that incumbents have is they tend to have more solidified personal and monetary connections. You're already in the office. Other people who have a similar office, for example, if you're a state house representative and you become buddy-buddy with a lot of other state house representatives, you have them as endorsements, for example, for your campaign, as long as you guys are getting along. You also get the party campaign arms. They usually make their resources more available to you. So the parties, they have their party apparatuses have specific organizations that deal with giving campaign resources to these campaigns. For example, the DCCC, which is the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee, they help out Democrats that are running for congressional elections, especially if they're running for reelection. The NRSC, which is the National Republican Senatorial Committee, they help out Republicans running for U.S. Senate. And you'll see similar kinds of party campaign arms and organizations that do the same thing at the state and local levels as well. Incumbents are also seeing fewer and fewer competitive elections because more and more districts are becoming distinctively Democrat or Republican. And so you tend to see the primary being what determines who makes it to the general election. These primaries are, especially if they're partisan primaries, they're effectively becoming the general election because the other party has little to no chance of winning. If you have a district that is in Maryland, for example, that is just so overwhelmingly Democrat, or you have a district in Texas that is so overwhelmingly Republican, the disadvantaged party just really doesn't even have a chance. And a lot of times, if they don't even have a chance, they won't even run a candidate. Or there might be a candidate for that disadvantaged party, but they get minimal support from their party's apparatus, their campaign apparatus, because they just can't afford to put resources into an election that their candidate has no chance of winning. They can put those resources toward other elections that they have a better chance of winning. So you see a lot of these fewer and fewer competitive districts over time, which, regardless of your opinions on politics, the lack of political competitiveness is a very serious issue. And especially for local level offices, some races won't have a challenger at all. Like, not even just this race has a Democrat but not a Republican. This race has a Republican but not a Democrat. They won't even have like a third party or nonpartisan challenger sometimes. So that's become a bigger issue for local level races like school boards. And some of this lack of competitiveness is due to gerrymandering, but it's not necessarily as widespread as you might expect, though the threshold for gerrymandering is not clear cut. You can look at some districts and be like, okay, that's clearly drawn in a way that's trying to benefit one party or the other. But a lot of times it's not this is the criteria that needs to be met to be considered gerrymandering. You don't really have that kind of checklist to say that a district is gerrymandered. But gerrymandering does happen, or at the very least, maybe not necessarily full on gerrymandered, but definitely drawn in a way to try to benefit another party, one party or the other, a little bit more than what might be considered fair. Incumbents also have the experience of already winning the office. Experience is a big deal in, well, really in basically any job that you do, and especially for politics. You have more data on what it takes to win that seat. And a lot of times for partisan candidates, because they already won in the first place, sometimes signals that their campaign or their party is more powerful and or capable of campaigning well. Maybe that already signifies that you are very well resourced or that the party is putting a lot of resources into helping you in the first place. Regular voters don't realize the power of talented campaigners. You might just have really people that are really good at knocking on doors, reaching out to voters, uh, that other campaigns just don't have, and that's how you won in the first place. So that experience of winning the office already is incredibly valuable to trying to win that seat again. There's also just a general reluctance to change officials once they are already in office. Sometimes it's a bit of a fear of the unknown. Uh, Usually, you're not going to see a whole lot of change unless dissatisfaction with the incumbent is strong enough. There's not enough motivation for somebody to vote against the incumbent unless they really feel like their the incumbent has their policies have directly hurt that person. You're usually not going to see a whole lot of change there. And some elected offices are obscure enough that people find it too difficult to find ample information on candidates, and thus they just stick with what they know, or they just don't even bother getting involved. But the people who elected that person in the first place, they do, and so that person gets reelected again. And a ballot information issue really hits everybody, even those of us who are heavily involved in politics. We have trouble with it a lot of times too. There's when you get really, really local, sometimes a lot harder to find information on who your local officials are. Now, some of the factors that can actually hurt incumbents, again, not a comprehensive list, and specific elections will have their own unique circumstances that can potentially hurt incumbents where it's actually not helpful for them to have an incumbency advantage. Generally speaking, being an incumbent is an advantage, but every so often you'll have obviously factors that actually hinder an incumbent in particular, not necessarily because of their party or any scandal, but simply because they're an incumbent. So general dissatisfaction with the incumbent president's party. And this is more so an issue for incumbents in Congress, being, for example, if you're dissatisfied with Donald Trump, you might be more inclined to vote against Republican congressional candidates. Or if you're dissatisfied with Joe Biden, you might be more inclined to vote against Democrats in Congress. But this can also trickle further down the ballot. And we're starting to see, not starting, we've been seeing it for a while, but it's starting to happen more and more, where you see a nationalization of politics, where even state and local politics are not necessarily considered so much separate from federal politics, where what's happening at the federal level is being considered at the state and local level. So, for example, a Republican county commissioner, for some people, there's a litmus test of how much they support Donald Trump. Even if the local issues have nothing to do with anything Donald Trump's doing, voters might vote on that county commissioner based on how they feel about Donald Trump or how they feel about Joe Biden. So what's happening at the national level is mattering for voters more and more at the state and local levels, and hence nationalization of state and local politics. An economic downturn. Economics is a very powerful motivator for people. And you saw it in this election, regardless of whose fault it is. Doesn't matter whether it's Republicans or Democrats' fault, it's Donald Trump's, it's Joe Biden's. That's not the point. Point is who is perceived to be at fault. And economic issues tend to be reflected on the incumbent's party, at least for federal elections. Again, could happen further down the ballot as well because of that nationalization of politics. And other incumbents of the same party are considered guilty by association. But Republicans have felt that hit before. Democrats have felt that hit before of is an economic downturn. Who's in office right now? Who is mostly in charge? Oh, it's this party, or oh, it's this person of this party. Other people of that party must also be guilty. It's obviously a more complex issue than simply, oh, that one person. It's because of them. But matters more in terms of who's winning these elections. It matters more about what voters perceive, who they perceive to be at fault. And again, I'm not saying that one party or the other is more responsible. That's just about who these voters think are at fault. Emotional reactions, obviously, anger and anxiety are powerful motivators for voters to come out and vote. But if you're angry and or anxious about current events, you may be more inclined to vote against an incumbent. We talked about just a little bit ago how usually people are reluctant to change unless there's a powerful enough stimulus to persuade them to vote against somebody. If you are terrified of somebody's policies, you might, they're an incumbent and their policies and what they've done in office already, you may be more inclined to come out to vote against them, as opposed to if you were just kind of lukewarm on them, or even if you didn't like them, but you weren't anxious about something that they were doing. So, all else equal, usually you're not going to act out against an incumbent if you aren't too perturbed about what's happening at a given level of office. And then there are cases when name recognition actually becomes a bane instead of a boon. For some incumbents, they might find that they get too much negative publicity simply by being more known as an elected official. There's also a potential of more sources of scandals because you are in office as opposed to if you were a challenger. So name recognition in that regard can be an issue. People might know who you are, but they don't necessarily have an opinion about you. If you look at polling data, sometimes you'll see questions basically asking, do you know who this person is? What do you think of this person? And they'll say favorable opinion, unfavorable opinion, or not sure. Sometimes you'll see that not sure be a lot higher than for another person. So sometimes you might want people to be more unsure about what they think of that incumbent, as opposed to if, oh, a lot of people know them and a lot of people don't like them. On to more about how we actually study incumbent win rates and how they can vary depending on the office. So we can compare win rates by several categories, including by the type of office. How often do congressional incumbents get reelected versus state executive incumbents versus state senator, state house, or local judges? Several examples of categories that you can consider. And then by state, states will vary in how often their incumbents win. And comparisons of those categories depend on several factors that can inflate or deflate win rates of a particular category. So, for example, some offices that are elected in one state are appointed in another state. And if they're appointed positions, doesn't really count in terms of how often an incumbent wins because there's no election for them to run in, so voters aren't voting on them. For example, Attorney General is elected by voters in 43 states. So those 7 states where it's not being voted on can't really compare because the whole incumbent win rate thing doesn't really apply to them because they're being appointed by governor or state legislature or whoever's doing the appointing. And then some states have much fewer fewer elected state executives overall than others. For example, Alaska just votes on governor and lieutenant governor, but it doesn't vote on attorney general and secretary of state. But North Carolina has 10 state executives that they vote on, including a labor commissioner and an agriculture commissioner. So some of them just aren't up for election by voters, and so you can't compare them as easily to other states and how they vote. And some offices have far more officials up for re-election at a time than others. For example, if you're talking about state legislative seats, especially in New Hampshire, where there's 400 state House representatives versus state executives, where you're never going to have nearly as many state executives up for election as you will state legislators. So if we're talking about how often do state executives win, incumbents win re-election versus state legislative incumbents running for re-election, well, there's a lot more state legislative incumbents running for re-election than there are state executive incumbents. So smaller sample size can skew the incumbent win rates a little bit or by a lot. And then some states might have relatively few elections in a given year compared to others. For example, New Jersey and Virginia have a lot of their elections in odd numbered years. So there's a small sample size for them in 2024 versus Florida or Georgia or California that have a lot more even numbered year elections, such as this one in 2024. And then you have also the timing of elections. Some states have a lot more elections in a midterm year versus a presidential election year or versus an odd numbered year, or they have a general election that's held in a different month. And an incumbent might have been defeated in a primary, and that potentially influences what happens in the general. Maybe that incumbent actually had a better shot at winning the whole thing than the person who beat them because the primary voters wanted somebody who was a quote unquote stronger Republican or a stronger Democrat. And when they get to the general election, more voters see them as too extreme. Just as an example, not necessarily going to be the case, but sometimes it is. So just a few caveats to keep in mind there. But that being said, let's look at some incumbent win rates in recent years. So a lot of this data is coming from Ballotpedia, at least this overall data for 2018, 2020, 2022, and 2024. And this data does not account for every single race that occurred across the U.S. That's basically an impossible task to document all of the local races, like I talked about before. A lot of this information is very difficult, if not impossible, to find. But I can tell you both from just observing Ballotpedia now and previously when I worked at Ballotpedia, Ballotpedia's scope, especially now, is incredibly expansive. There are a lot of elections under their umbrella. They've got all the federal elections and they've got all the state level elections. And they have a ton of the local level races as well. And Ballotpedia still has all the incumbent win rates for Congress, state executives, state legislatures, and state level judges, which is what we're using here. And of course, this data does not include incumbents who ran for a different office or retired, because then that's considered an open seat. So a general overview of 2018 to 2024, according to Ballotpedia, there was a 92% win rate in 2018. Overall, 93% win rate in 2020, 94% in 2022, and 95% in 2024. So already, again, very, very high incumbent re-election rates, and it started to trickle, I guess not trickle, but started to creep up and up and up and up. As for incumbent win rates over time by type of office, a couple of examples. We'll talk about presidents, and this is what I referenced earlier on in the podcast about there being a little bit of variation in incumbent win rates. You typically see very, very high win rates. In the case of president, incumbents tend to win, but it's actually not an enormous advantage like you see for Congress. So we've had a total of 33 presidential elections where the incumbent ran for re-election, and 20 incumbents have won 22 re-election bids. Franklin Roosevelt won 3 of them. He's the only president we've had that has won more than 2 terms because the U.S. constitutional amendment that instituted the 2-term limit was not applied until post Harry Truman, or it was ratified to the Constitution during Harry Truman's presidency, but Harry Truman was exempt from the amendment, and every president since him has been subject to that two-term limit. So you won't ever see a president win multiple reelection bids. They'll only win one of them at most. So 20 incumbents have won 22 reelection bids. 11 presidents have run for reelection but lost, and that includes the two presidents that have won non-consecutive terms, Grover Cleveland being the first one in the latter 19th century, and now Donald Trump winning in 2024. He has now joined Grover Cleveland as the only presidents who have served non-consecutive terms, or at least Donald Trump will soon be doing that when the new presidential term actually starts. But before Donald Trump lost in 2020, incumbents had won 3 straight reelection bids. So it had been more common lately for presidents running for reelection to win their reelection bids. And then governor, this is via Rutgers University's Center on the American Governor. For the most part, the rate has increased since the 1960s. So in the 1960s, incumbent governors won re-election 64% of the time. In the 1970s, went up a little bit to 69%. 1980s, 74%. 1990s, 81%. Very slight dip in the 2000s where it went to 80%. Then back up 85% in the 2010s or 20-teens, however you say it. And then 2020 to 2023, 98%. The only incumbent who lost in that time frame, there's 39 of 40 incumbents won re-election in that time frame. The only one who lost was Steve Sisolak to Joe Lombardo in Nevada in 2022. Now, as for the final section, before we close this episode out, let's talk about 2024 incumbent win statistics specifically. Now, keep in mind, there are still some undecided races here and there at the state and local levels. Not many of them left, but there are a few. And for federal elections, we still have 2 U.S. House races in California that are too close to call still. As is usually the case, though, 2024 saw extremely high win rates, regardless of category. Obviously, president doesn't apply here because Joe Biden didn't. Well, he initially ran for re-election, but then dropped out, and then Kamala Harris ran. So incumbency didn't really, at least in this context, didn't really apply here. But of the 7,412 incumbents covered by Ballotpedia this year, 95% of them won re-election. And if we go by office type, 98% of congressional incumbents won re-election. Again, still a couple of U.S. House races in California that are undecided, so that might slightly change the percentage, but not by a lot. It's going to be somewhere 97, 98, 99%. 96% of state executives won re-election, 93% of state judicial, that being state Supreme Courts and intermediate appellate courts, 97% of state legislative incumbents, and there are a lot of those this year, as there tend to be, 93% of local executives, so for example, mayors of cities, and then 98% of local judicial elections, so those local level judges, like a county judge, for example, and then 90% of local legislative incumbents that ran for re-election won. So city council, for example, there. Comparing specific states, whether they had high versus low incumbent win rates, again, got to keep in mind that some states have a lot more elections, had a lot more elections this year than other states did. But putting that aside, states that saw particularly high rates of incumbent wins include West Virginia, Tennessee, Delaware, Washington, Rhode Island. States where incumbent wins were a bit lower were Virginia, New Jersey, Alaska, Arizona, and Mississippi. As for specific types of offices, in Congress, 42 states elected 100% of their incumbents who ran for re-election. Again, keep in mind the wide disparity in U.S. House delegations by state. The exceptions here include Alaska, California, Colorado, Montana, a few other states. And once again, account for those far fewer U.S. House members. For example, California has the most, and there's a lot of them to account for, whereas Alaska only has one U.S. House race. And as for state legislature, 6 states had no state legislative elections this year, so they're excluded here, and those were Alabama, Louisiana, Maryland, Mississippi, New Jersey, and Virginia. But the other 44 states had at least 80% of their incumbents reelected. 11 states reelected 100% of their incumbents. 39 states reelected 95% or more. There were a few states that were below 95%, but weren't many. Those 5 states were Nebraska, which had 80%, Vermont, 87% of state legislative incumbents, Alaska, 88%, New Hampshire, 93%, and Wisconsin, 93%. So that does it for this episode of the podcast. As always, thank you so much for listening. Random question of the day time. And when this episode comes out, this is relevant to the day after this podcast episode comes out. Today's random question is, what's your ideal Thanksgiving meal? I'm going to tell you right now. Turkey, dark meat, has to be dark meat. White meat is usually way too dry. Stuffing, it's not dressing. I don't care if it was made in the turkey or not. It's stuffing. Mashed potatoes with gravy, corn pudding, and I'm not including dessert here. And King's Hawaiian rolls, absolutely. I mean, how can you not have rolls? And then you can basically make sandwiches with Thanksgiving leftovers. And I actually just tried out the other day some cranberry sauce. I had it in my head that I didn't like cranberry sauce, and then I tried it as like, okay, I have to add this. So any other combination of Thanksgiving dinners, vastly inferior. Don't tell me green bean casserole, because green bean casserole is gross. It does not matter who made it. I despise green beans. My sister loves them, and I don't understand how anybody likes green beans. So green bean casserole is absolutely out the window. Corn pudding, though, love me some corn pudding. That's my ideal Thanksgiving meal, and let me know what yours is. But other than that, we're going to close this out. So once again, as always, thank you so much for listening. Got my social media and other stuff in my show notes, including my book, Why Independents Rarely Win Elections and How They Can Become More Competitive, on Amazon in ebook and paperbook format, my Facebook, LinkedIn, Medium, Matchmaker FM profile. If you want to have me on your podcast, or possibly you be on my podcast, and my email, paulraderwrites@gmail.com. But other than that, I'll see you or talk to you in the next episode. Until then, take care.